Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. This is our 60th anniversary, if you can call it that, of the disturbances which broke out in 1964. So now that we're in 2024, we need to look back to understand what happened in 1964 so that as we go forward, we don't make the same mistakes again. And we don't allow the wounds and the injuries that were inflicted on our nation in 1964 to hinder our development and our achievement of real independence this year, 2024 and onwards. The next generation must not be inflicted, must not be wounded by the injuries that were inflicted on our people in 1964. My friends, I would like to examine a little more closely than before, what happened in Maikoni. If you know the geography of Maikoni, you know it's really a long river running from the coastline right up to and beyond St. Francis Mission, which is now called Maracaibo. It's in Region 5 now. And some horrible murders took place there. 30 murders took place there between June, July, and August 1964. 30 murders. Some people were killed by machine gun fire. We need to understand that it is not some sideshow. People focus on, yes, justifiably they focus on what happened at the Son Chapman and Wismar and elsewhere, Buxton. But Maikoni suffered a lot. June, July, August 1964. When the Premier of British Guyana, person who's responsible for government, declared a hurricane of protests, many people didn't take him seriously, but it is remembered as the worst episode of state-sponsored terrorism. Listen to me carefully, state-sponsored terrorism in our history. This isn't civil war, this wasn't communal rioting, this wasn't inter-ethnic violence. This is state-sponsored terrorism. And there's never been such an incident before. But when we come to deal with the troubles, you see another example of state-sponsored terrorism. But the disturbances were the first really terrible episode. They inflicted more deaths on our population than the British colonial government did. The victims of violence were not the British imperialists and the sugar planters. They were Guyanese, ordinary poor Guyanese. And the hurricane of protests, far from hurrying independence, hindered independence. So when we hear people talking about the father of independence, you can imagine what happened in 1964 and said, this is the man who did most to prevent Guyana becoming independent in 1962, along with Trinidad and Jamaica. We should have been independent in 1962 if we had a balanced electoral system. But the administration at the time, the PPP administration, decided to use violence to prevent any other person, any other party leading this country to independence. That's what it is all about. That is what it is all about. And we were held back behind Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, which got independence in 1962. My friends, the British government's resolve to continue to prepare for elections in 1964, it was irreversible. That is a big problem. The British government decided to have elections in 1964. So from the start of 1964, there was violence in this country right up to December 1964 when elections were held. The British Guyana governors, that time governor for the most of that year was Sir Richard Late. But his declaration of a state of emergency meant that he assumed responsibility for public security because he realized that the PPP was not interested in human safety and public security. After the violence had lasted for 100 days, he asked for more military support from the British Army. And on the 22nd of May, he declared a state of emergency. You know why he declared a state of emergency on the 22nd of May? It is because the murder of George and Clotilde Seeley in Buxton occurred on the 21st of May. 24 hours later, the governor of British Guiana declared a state of emergency and asked for more troops because he now understood the seriousness of the PPP campaign of terror, the hurricane of protest. Further to that, the PPP Minister of Home Affairs resigned on the 1st of June. See the chain of events? When she resigned, note the gender, when she resigned her responsibility for public security and human safety, we realized that something terrible was going to happen. When in the midst of a crisis, the Minister of Home Affairs resigned, we realized that attention was going to be paid to other matters other than human safety and public security. My friends, all of these events led to the realization that the hurricane of protest, which had been declared by the premier of this country in January 1964, had started to falter. So it triggered a revision of the PPP's approach to terrorism by May 1964. They felt the hurricane was not achieving its purposes. So all of these events, the resignation and the preparation for elections and the state of emergency, showed that the hurricane was in trouble and they needed a new direction, perhaps a more intense campaign of violence. And this is exactly what was about to happen. We know that the first murder took place at Tain on the quarantine on the 4th of March. And we know that there was violence on the West Coast Demerara, what is now Region 3, and also East Coast Demerara, Region 4. But from May, it was decided that geographically and operationally, this state-sponsored terrorism had to be extended. When I speak of state-sponsored terrorism, I speak about the government of British Guiana at that time, not the British government in London, the government that had been elected here in 1961. It had as its objective to discourage the British government from implementing the very electoral and constitutional reforms that it had agreed to and were imposed in October 1963 at the Constitutional Conference in London. And we know that the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union had been agitated for representation in the sugar industry. They struck on the pretext of demanding a recognition by the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association. But that was a pretext to mobilize sugar workers to wage war on behalf of the PPP against the Guyanese nation. There was no chance that they could achieve recognition by burning sugarcane and bombing factories. They knew that they were fighting a political battle, not an industrial battle. So GAWU's function was to mobilize sugar workers to support terror. That is why we had the problems, and we will deal with those problems later on the West Coast Demerara and Region 3. and also in Region 6 at places like Tain. My friends, I go back to the resignation of the Minister of Home Affairs on the 1st of June. She said it was in the wake of the Wismar atrocity, which occurred on the 25th of June, which is 4 days after the murder of the Sealeys in Buxton. 2 people were killed in those riots. There were lots of other very nasty things that occurred. Arson, a lot of business places were burned, but most of the offenses were against property. Some of the offenses were against persons. Some people were beaten and some women were raped. But essentially, only 2 persons were killed. And by using that as a pretext to resign as Minister of Home Affairs cannot be separated from 3 important subsequent events. 11 days after she resigned as Minister of Home Affairs, we had the massacre of the Abraham family in Working Rust, Georgetown. Then we had the massacre of Africans at Huradaya in the Son Chapman incident. And then we had the massacre of Africans in Maikoni, starting from the 23rd of June. So 3 big massacres, the 3 worst massacres of the disturbances occurred after the PPP Minister of Home Affairs had resigned. You know, history tells a strange tale. Sometimes there are unintended consequences, but here you can see the chain of events, and you can see that the PPP culpability is laid bare. I mentioned once again, as I did on a previous occasion, that in April, on the 27th of April, almost exactly a month before the Sealeys were killed, the police dug up a cache of ammunition, pistols, rifles, shotguns, submachine guns, gelignite, and other materials for manufacturing bombs in a cane field in Triumph Village. Well, this is Triumph Village, it's not BV, Triumph Village. It's a PPP stronghold in what is now Region 4. So as a prelude to these massacres, we see the police coming upon this cache of weapons and ammunition and explosives. And it only happened because one of the persons who had been trained by the PPP had divulged this information. I don't know what happened to him after that, if they ever found out who it was. But the spate of arson, assault, battery, bombing, murder, sabotage, displacement of persons triggered by the hurricane of protests and the Gao strike started to spread exponentially, operationally, geographically, murderously throughout the country from May 1964. It is a terrible time for those of you who were alive, you'll remember. So there was a state of emergency because the British governor decided quite sensibly that the PPP wasn't interested in protecting human lives. In fact, they were the main perpetrators of violence against humans. So he took control and he was able to seek further military support from Britain. So he declared a state of emergency, and 2 other regiments from Britain came here, the Royal Kent, it's called the Queen's Own Buffs, the Royal Kent Regiment, and the Devon and Dorset Regiment. So Guyana was in almost continuous occupation by the British troops from 1953 to 1966. 18 regiments came to this country. They came here because of the PPP, and they stayed here because of the PPP. That is why we were under occupation by British Army for such a long time. So some of the troops were even stationed at the Cottage Hospital. I don't know if you know Maikoni very well, but there was a Cottage Hospital there on the main road. The troops were billeted there, so they had easy access to the Maikoni Creek, Maikoni River, from time to time. But you had a large number of troops there because Maikoni was the trouble spot. And it was so long and deep. People living in some of the villages, and many of the African villages are little, almost you can say, ethnic islands along that riverbank. If you go down the branch road, you'll see what the demographic and geographic layout hasn't changed much. They haven't changed much over the last 60 years. But it's very hard for people living miles, several kilometers along the branch road to get out without passing through villages which were hostile to them. My friends, we can look a bit now at causation. What was the protest aimed at achieving? What was the Gawu strike aimed at achieving? They wanted to make Guyana, at that time British Guyana, ungovernable. They wanted to prevent the introduction of the PR system because they felt they would lose the elections. They wanted to prevent the conduct of elections because they felt that they would lose, and they wanted to prolong their tenure in office. And they wanted to have independence before elections were held. That is why hundreds of people died. Because the PPP wanted to be the party that took Guyana into independence. And it didn't happen. So they introduced the so-called hurricane of protests, and people were murdered. In particular, as I said, on this program, we look at what happened in Maikoni. Because the murders in African Guyanese communities in the Maikoni, particularly, were unmistakably ethnic. This is nothing but ideology. This is nothing but political participation. I think in most of these programs, I've avoided using expressions like race war or civil war. It was not a race war. It was not a civil war. It was state-sponsored terrorism against its own citizens. That is what it was. It was state-sponsored terrorism against its own citizens, aimed at making the country ungovernable. Ungovernable. In Maikoni particular, after the troubles in May, in Buxton, 21st of May, when the Sealeys were killed, and at Wismar, when 2 persons were killed, and then you had the resignation of the minister from the 1st of June, and then you had the Abraham family massacre in Working Ross in Georgetown. But by the 23rd of June, when the violence moved to the east, Maikoni is not in a sugar belt. There are no sugar workers there. These are not strike breakers. These are poor farmers. And on the 23rd of June, a pastor of the Pilgrim Holiness Church, his son Eustace Waldron and Joseph Ned were killed by machine gun fire. My friends, this is not a communal clash. This is not gang fighting one another in the street. These people were killed by machine gun fire. 5 terrorists went into Perth And in 3 hours, port and supply villages, if you know the geographical layout of that river, in 3 hours, they just machine gunned the village. And a wave of violence, even when people were trying to escape, they got shot. So those villages, Perth, Supply, and Number 10, became victims of PPP terror. So this is not something that was unknown to the PPP. They could have stopped it because they knew where the guns came from, and they knew what the targets were, and they knew why certain villages were being targeted. 4 days later, more shooting. Reginald Blake, Joseph Campbell, Alan Griffith, Bertil Thompson, Beryl Wesley were all reported missing. When people travel along the Maikoni River in these little boats we call balahoos, those days people don't have outboard engines. They were little homemade type of flat bottom boats for carrying their produce, their plantains and cassava, pumpkin, and so on. So when they were reported missing, it meant usually they were killed. So all these people, Blake, Campbell, Griffith, Thompson, Wesley, were reported missing from Port Village. They all went to their farms in balahoos because the most reliable means of transport was by the river, same as you find in Pomeroon today. But that was Maikoni River. The worst incident was on the 8th of July, 1964. George Halley, Sidney Halley, if you know the Halleys come from Maikoni. George Halley, Sidney Halley, Neil Bascom, Royston Bourne, Kenneth Gibbons, Percy Richmond, all from Strathcampbell, were reported missing. The story is that their neighbors told them that their cattle were straying in the savannas. But when they went out to look for the straying cattle, they were found by some people in horseback with guns who shot them down. And some of the bodies were never found because the bodies were tied up on logs and sunk in the Maikoni River. So the only reason we ever knew about those murders was because I think in one case, a man fell into a ditch and he was able to make his way all upriver to what was then St. Francis Mission, now called Murakabai. And the PNC sent a Land Rover around and was able, around the back way, and was able to pick him up from St. Francis and bring him out to hospital. That's how Guyana came to learn of the massacre of the 8th of July at Maikoni. 23rd of July, Ivan Chung was shot dead, and Cyril Robinson, Ernest DeGar and his wife were reported missing. Ernest DeGar's body was found later on riddled with gunshots and tied to a log with barbed wire. There was some log, I don't know what it's called, some types of wood, if it's called ironwood, that sinks to the bottom. It doesn't float. But they probably picked up the wrong type of log this time, and the body floated up, still tied up with barbed wire. So this was methodical murder. This wasn't accidental murder. This wasn't crossfire. This was targeted and methodical massacre. By 4th of August, again, 4 men and women fell into the river after being shot. They fell into the river and became missing. What the terrorists would do, they would bait on the riverbank or go up in a tree. And when these balahoos were passing, they started shooting at the balahoos. Of course, the balahoos were slow moving, and the terrorists had machine guns. And before they could reach the riverbank, if they weren't killed in the boats, you know, they would be shot at. So when they're described as missing, means they're dead. And this accounts for the fact that during this period, June, July, August, 30 persons of African descent were killed by terrorism in the Maikoni River alone. Eventually, there were retaliatory actions after these killings, after people disappeared, after we had these cases of missing persons. And some members of the Suknandan family and Ali family, Jaikaran family, all Indian Guyanese, were attacked, presumably in retaliation for the murders which had been taking place. So once peaceful Maikoni, not in the sugar belt, not involved in Gawu strike, became a war zone between June and August 1964. So the British Army, not the British Ghana Police Force, the British Army was able to announce by the end of August that 200 persons of Indian descent had been arrested in Maikoni during their operations. 200 persons were arrested on suspicion of being involved in violent action. On the previous program, I had said there are some ways of interpreting or analyzing or explaining this violence. I mentioned then, and I repeat for emphasis, there's this theory of retaliation, which suggests that once a murder is committed, it could trigger another murder, which itself could trigger another murder. It could trigger anger. And once the people are angry, they would commit murder as a form of revenge. And so the cycle goes on in retaliation. So when one person is murdered, there's anger by the relatives and friends of the victims, and they would turn and commit a murder. And that murder itself would stir up anger. So there's a theory of retaliation. There's also the theory of unintended consequences. That is, maybe the PVP thought they would stop elections, but in an opposite way, they triggered people's resolve to participate in elections. And the election of 1964 had the greatest turnout in the history of elections in Guyana. Over 96% of the people turned out to vote because they were determined to remove the PPP from office after a year of violence. So there was unintended consequences that they didn't win the support of the people, but they lost the love and affection of the Guyanese people because of the terror they inflicted during 1964. And then there was the theory of extreme effects. That is, terrorism doesn't only kill innocent persons. It makes people with opinions shut up because they're afraid of being shot at. It distorts the public debate because people don't want to go in the press and criticize the government because they'll be targeted. It's still happening now. You see how the government responds to non-governmental organizations and civil society. That's where it started. So people don't want to go up in public and be identified with anti-government positions. So moderate people keep quiet. Societies are divided, and extremists are empowered. So this is what happens during periods of extreme violence as we had in Guyana, in British Guyana in 1964. And worst of all, there's the theory of social learning. Young people seeing their parents or elders shot down by machine gun fire learn to be aggressive because they feel that others are getting by, others are achieving their goals by violence. Others are being rewarded by violence, which results from their behavior. And this is what happens when young people see the seniors or adults in society. And at the level of the PPP administration, everyone was aware who was behind it. Everyone was aware who was bringing guns in the country. Everyone was aware that the PPP refused to call a state of emergency when people in West Demerara were being slaughtered. On a previous occasion, I told you Sidney King, put on a black cloak and sat down outside Government House, calling for a state of emergency to prevent the slaughter, to deploy troops to prevent the slaughter in West Demerara. But the governor was telling him in April that he hadn't been advised by the PPP administration to call a state of emergency. But by May, he just got the government in London to pass an order of council which empowered him to call a state of emergency without referring to the PPP administration. So that is what actually happened. So the social learning by young people who saw adults massacring one another, saw the government supporting terrorism, is one of the unintended consequences of that period. My friends, again, we could look at the economic stagnation of villages because people were afraid to go to the back dam, afraid to go to the farms in the balahus. Because if you know the Maikoni, people were in some places in the riverbank just waiting until they see a balahu coming and they shoot indiscriminately. So some of the farmers stopped going to the farms because they were afraid to be killed, afraid of being killed. Then there's social division before the disturbances. Before the disturbances, Africans and Indians lived amicably in the Maikoni district along the Maikoni River. That was shattered after the disturbances when specific villages were targeted for killing by machine guns and explosives and arson. And then there was the damage to political relations between parties. The parties could sit down around the table to discuss ways of moving British Guiana forward. But after the disturbances, nobody wanted to sit down with the PPP. That party has blood on its hands. And inter-party relations suffered. And at the end of 1964, the PPP, the PNC, and the United Force decided to combine their seats in the Legislative Assembly, which now became the National Assembly, in order to shut the PPP out of office. The best thing that ever happened to Guyana. My friends, you can see what happened therefore in 1964, particularly in Maikoni. And I've chosen all these examples today from Maikoni. And perhaps one of these days you can go there to see the linear geographical configuration of that district. The problem is that the PPP abandoned its first and foremost function of the state, that is to protect its citizens, the responsibility to protect. I think nowadays the political scientists call it R2P, responsibility to protect. Secondly, terror was inflicted on unarmed, uninvolved, and unresisting poor people. These are not people who are shooting back. These are farmers going in their balahus to their farms, and they were being shot at by people with machine guns. The terror of the Maikoni murders in 1964, June, July, and August, also had the unintended consequences which hindered independence. We could have been independent alongside Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962. But the people who claimed to be responsible for bringing independence were the ones who hindered independence, who hampered the Guyanese people, who undermined the development of our country and our community for the last 60 years. And we alive today must try to prevent a recurrence of that sort of state-sponsored terrorism which did so much damage to Guyana 60 years ago, and which did damage which is still visible in many of our villages in Guyana today. I hope we never have to undergo the type of violence that Marconi saw in 1964 again, ever. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.